Shana Tova. Though the new year reminds us of the abundance of opportunity that awaits us in our lives, it also reminds us of the work that has yet to be done. Tonight, we'll consider how we've fallen woefully short of our aspirations as individuals and as a community regarding violence against women. As such, we'll be discussing rather challenging topics of sex and violence. So if you're accompanied by children that may not be prepared for such a discussion, or if these topics may be triggering to you, you're welcome to take a few moments respite at any point during our discussion before rejoining us for the remainder of the service. So you guys are along for the ride then? Okay. It's not anything we don't see on TV anyway, unfortunately. On a warm summer evening in 2012, the sun set quietly on the often overlooked town of Steubenville, Ohio. During the night, many of the town's youth celebrated the imminent commencement of the new high school football season, in which two of Big Red's finest, Malik Richmond and Trent Mays, hoped to add their names to the rosters of Ohio State champions. But by sunrise, the spirit of optimism that permeated the small town had given way to a sense of shock and dismay. That night, Big Red's two star players had picked up a 16-year-old girl at a local party. They walked her to a second party, and they carried her unconscious to a third. And then they proceeded to record their exploits with her, creating a haphazard documentary of photos, videos, and tweets that showed the sleeping girl in various states of public undress and abuse. Before the girl even woke up the next morning, her assault had already become regional news, courtesy of Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. News of the case quickly spread, leading news anchors and social media mavens across the nation to chime in. And while many lent their support to the survivor, countless others, including members of the town's own law enforcement, rallied around the two boys, questioning the girl's integrity and bemoaning the damage her claims portended for two bright young scholar athletes. Perhaps no one truly underscored public sentiment quite like one of the team's football coaches, who told reporters, "What else are you going to tell your parents when you come home drunk like that? She had to make up something. Now people are trying to blow up our football program because of it." The girl had hoped that justice would be served when the two young men were punished. But even after the courts delivered a guilty verdict 7 months later, her public ordeal, unfortunately, continued. At their sentencing, a CNN correspondent remarked that it was incredibly emotional and difficult to watch what happened as these two young men that had such promising futures, star football players, very good students, we literally watched as their lives fell apart. What went unsaid, however, was how the survivor's life had fallen apart at the hands of these two young men who violated her, as well as the town that stood by and watched it happen. Meanwhile, observers from across the country, with little to no knowledge of the actual proceedings, continued to offer their uninformed criticism, as we so often do today, in 140 characters or less. The girl asked for it and wanted it. In my opinion, no crime. #don't drink. Not saying she asked for it, but why did she consume so much alcohol in the first place? 16-year-old girl drinking and getting drunk. Where are our moral societal values? Be responsible for your actions, ladies, before your drunken decisions ruin innocent lives. Like countless other survivors, Jane Doe in Steubenville discovered that American society at large is rarely concerned with justice for those who experience gender violence. Instead, a nation which ought to be focused upon deterring sexual assault and bringing its perpetrators to justice remains far too inclined to place survivors rather than their perpetrators on trial. In fact, 5 years ago in Liberty County, Texas, a defense lawyer described an 11-year-old gang rape victim as a spider who skillfully lured 20 men into sexually assaulting her. 2 years ago, in response to a sexual assault convict's 6-month prison sentence, the assailant's father complained that his son faced a steep price to pay for 20 minutes of action. Those 20 minutes included sexually assaulting an unconscious woman behind a dumpster before fleeing the scene when bystanders intervened. Meanwhile, a Department of Justice investigation into the Baltimore Police Department revealed that police officers routinely interrogated survivors with dismissive questions such as, "Could you be imagining that?" Or, "Why are you messing up that guy's life?" The report also noted that a sex crimes detective in Baltimore had complained, "In a homicide, there are real victims. All our cases are just nonsense." This is the reality that survivors of sexual assault, sexual harassment, and domestic abuse face in our country. And yet time and again we wonder how gender violence is so widespread in America and why survivors fail to come forward and report their attackers. When we report a break-in, no one asks us why we left our homes unguarded. When we file a malpractice claim, no one laments the future of the promising young doctor. But when a woman dares to report the crimes against her, the very people charged with protecting her safety question her integrity, while people with little to no knowledge of the case publicly mourn the fate of the perpetrator. All of a sudden, what you wore, what you drank, when you smiled, who you've dated, all become matters for public debate. And this occurs only in the rare instance that there's enough evidence to even try the case. And so, women learn at a very young age that violence against women is exclusively their problem and therefore exclusively their responsibility. But gender violence is not a woman's issue. It's a global issue. It's an American issue. It's a Jewish issue. And it's a men's issue. Across the globe, violence against women has been and continues to be a crime of pandemic proportions. India's dowry system and China's one-child policy have sparked a tide of female infanticide that has killed hundreds of millions of infant girls, while antiquated notions of family honor routinely doom women in the Middle East and Latin America, where 47% of all women killed are murdered by relatives for having sex outside of marriage, including rape. Meanwhile, the fastest growing business in the world isn't iBanking or real estate. It's sex trafficking, a worldwide enterprise that sexually exploits 21 million women each year. And though the safety of women in the United States exceeds the extremely low bar set throughout many regions in the world, gender violence still represents a clear and present domestic danger. 1 out of every 5 American women will be sexually assaulted in her lifetime, while 1 out of every 4 will experience domestic violence of some sort. That would be around 130 people in the room tonight. And women aren't the only targets. Though the number of male victims pales in comparison to that of their female counterparts, men of all backgrounds have survived sexual assault and domestic abuse. Nor are Jewish communities exempt from this epidemic. Gender violence transcends the boundaries of race, religion, socioeconomics, ethnicity, and even sexual preference. We can find it in our synagogues. We can find it in our schools. We can find it in our hillels and in our Jewish nonprofits. In fact, the Jewish struggle with gender violence is as old as the Bible itself. In the book of Samuel, we read the horrific story of Tamar, daughter of King David. Obsessed with her beauty, Tamar's half-brother, Amnon, devises a plan to get her alone and force himself upon her. But once he has taken what he wants, Amnon's obsession turns to hatred, and he dismisses her. No longer a virgin, Tamar's biblical value diminishes, and the crime against her turns into a lifelong shame that she must bear alone. When the celebrated King David finds out about this crime, he grows angry, but refuses to punish his son Amnon because he loved him since he was his firstborn. Thus, no rebuke comes for Amnon, and no justice comes for Tamar. Later, Tamar's brother Absalom murders Amnon and rebels against the crown, but that's of little consolation to Tamar, whose story, like too many today, ends only in silence. David's refusal to intercede not only justifies and intensifies Tamar's trauma, it directly contradicts the values that our tradition holds most dear. Since its beginnings, Judaism has emphasized the importance of safeguarding human dignity. Our sages even compare shaming people to killing them. What would they say about letting someone suffer in silence? Or worse yet, insisting that her trauma was her fault? Though we may not have a particularly enviable history in our text of addressing it, violence against women is definitively a Jewish issue. And what's more, violence against women affects each of us, women and men, on a deeply personal level. Every person in this room, whether we're aware of it or not, knows someone who has survived sexual assault, domestic abuse, or sexual harassment. And every person in this room is a parent, a child, a sibling, or a friend to a woman whose life has been forever changed by the epidemic of gender violence. Now, I didn't really understand the true pervasiveness of the problem until my wife shared a story with me from one of her freshman seminars in college, where a professor asked all the men in the room, "What steps do you take on a daily basis to prevent yourselves from being sexually assaulted?" At first, there was an awkward silence. Some of the guys looked around confused, as if the teacher had just asked a trick question. Finally, someone spoke up and said, "Nothing. I don't think I've ever thought about it." Then the teacher asked the women in the room the same question. "What do you do on a daily basis to prevent yourself from being sexually assaulted?" Here are their answers. "I don't park between two large trucks or SUVs. I always carry a cell phone in my hand. I don't go running at night. I take self-defense classes. I close all the windows when I go to sleep. I never rent an apartment on the first floor. I carry pepper spray. I watch what I wear. I only go out in groups. I meet men on dates in public places. I don't drink too much. I don't make eye contact with men on the street. I try not to smile at men in the gym or at coffee shops because I don't want to send them the wrong message." Now, when I heard this story for the first time, I was shocked and saddened. I thought I knew all I needed to know about sexual assault. But I was clueless about the broad impact that gender violence wrought in the everyday lives of the women that I knew and cared for. So no, gender violence is not a women's issue. It's our issue. And though it would be nice to believe that anyone who would assault, batter, or harass a woman possesses some sort of deviant criminal mind that's beyond our ability to socialize, well, the facts just don't bear it out. The clear majority of assailants, more than 80%, are individuals with close relationships to a survivor. Their boyfriends, their friends, their family members. And so if we're going to have any chance at defeating gender violence, then we're going to have to critically examine the culture surrounding this scourge upon our world. Now, to be fair, I've run into plenty of people who are reluctant to discuss a link between culture and gender violence, and that's understandable. In our community, men and women alike understand that violence against women is unacceptable and that we should do our very best to stop it. The problem is that it can be very difficult to see how our everyday, seemingly innocuous choices can sometimes perpetuate a culture that justifies or promotes violence against women without us even realizing it. Now imagine for a moment, if you can, it's a little easier for me because I used to do this, that we're all soldiers serving together in the same company. You're on guard duty, waiting for your teammate to relieve you, but he never shows up. You fill out 2 shifts in a row, you're really tired, you go to your company commander to complain. Maybe she investigates, maybe she doesn't. Maybe she punishes the guilty party, maybe she doesn't. But in the meantime, everyone else in your squad, everyone else in your company starts asking you why you didn't call to remind your teammate when to show up, why you didn't get his uniform ready, why you even agreed to take that shift in the first place. Everybody knows that your teammate ditches guard duty. Why didn't you know? So, what have you learned? You think you'll go to your commander again? Do you think your teammate's going to take guard duty more seriously? What do you think the rest of the company has learned? When soldiers violate a regulation and their superiors and their fellow soldiers make excuses for their behavior, then they learn that that regulation doesn't really matter. And not only do they learn it, the whole company learns it, especially those who have been directly affected. And yet, this is exactly what happens every time gender violence goes public. And it's exactly what happened in Steubenville. What was she drinking? What was she wearing? Did she fight back? Notice how so few of the questions we see in the public sphere have anything to do with the perpetrators themselves. All they do is blame and judge the survivor. If we wish to discourage gender violence as a society, then we need to stop putting survivors on trial in the news and on social media. And we need to deliver a message to those who do. It's not our responsibility to protect alleged assailants. There are lawyers for that. But it is our responsibility to create a culture that encourages survivors to come forward and sends the message that gender violence is not acceptable in our community. That's how we can stand up for survivors. But unfortunately, that's only a start. To truly combat gender violence, we have to discourage it before it happens. And to do that, we need to look at the cultural messages that lead to it. From television shows that depict denigration and violence towards women as sexy and passionate, to coming-of-age movies that teach our children that victory includes getting the girl, to our all too often ignorant vocabulary surrounding gender and sexuality. Our culture routinely reinforces the idea that sex is some sort of prerequisite to masculinity, and that women are either a rival to be conquered or a prize to be won. And believe me, our youth is getting the message loud and clear. Countless teenage phones, male and female, contain lurid examples of evaluating women based strictly on their appearance. Imagine sexual acts that a male would do to a female friend. And unfortunately, even imagined acts of violence of men towards women. We only need to look at Steubenville to see how this plays out in real life. In each party that Jane Doe visited, conscious or unconscious, any number of bystanders could have intervened to ensure her safety. Instead, they took photos criticizing her. They posted videos mocking her. They offered suggestions for humiliating her. And then they went back to their party. And we shouldn't think that adolescence is a requirement to listen to these sorts of messages that our society is sending. Just this past week, Mandy Castle, a young mother, shared online how the culture we've created around gender violence is affecting her 6-year-old daughter in school. When her daughter came home complaining of bullying, she assumed that her daughter was just exaggerating. But when her daughter revealed how two fellow 6-year-old boys had repeatedly grabbed her butt, and when she told them to stop, responded by calling her fat and laughing at her, she knew that something was amiss. These actions seem simple, but they reflect seriously disturbing notions of what it means to be a man, even at a young age. But we shouldn't be surprised. After all, our children are only learning what we've been teaching them. The newcomer to a party trying to curry favor with a rape joke. The boss encouraging us to take charge by growing some balls. The teammate chastising us for cowardice by saying, "Don't be a," I think you can figure out the word. The parents justifying their child's aggressive behavior by saying, "Boys will be boys." None of these people mean harm. In fact, most of them are just trying to fit into a culture they don't even understand. But the fact that none of us would be surprised by any of these phrases is telling. Our culture speaks the language of gender violence, and whether we like it or not, the people around us, including our children, know how to translate it. Now, I get that the connection can seem preposterous, even tenuous. Do you think I've never said any of those things? I was in the Army for 16 years. I've said things that would make every single person in this room blush. And like so many others, I bristled when people around me started to point out that I was contributing to a culture of gender violence. I thought they were just trying to make me politically correct. After all, how can a meaningless comment possibly encourage real acts of violence? But that's the problem. There's no such thing as a meaningless comment. Our words have real consequences. A simple but underestimated truth that our tradition is very well aware of. It is the power of words that brings this world into being. God spoke, and the world came to be. And it is the power of words that makes us creators of this world too. The Hebrew for word, davar, also means thing. In Judaism, an idea gains substance. It becomes a thing only once it's spoken. In fact, what we often call the 10 Commandments, the most precious instructions we receive from God, are in Hebrew called Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 spoken things. While our speech may seem ephemeral, our words possess the awesome ability to command, to inspire, and to persuade. As the 20th century theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel teaches, we shall never be able to understand that the Spirit is revealed in the form of words unless we discover the vital truth that speech has power, that words are commitments. And so every misogynist comment, every sexually charged catcall, every thoughtless reference to a woman's body reverberates throughout the echo chamber of American culture, crystallizing into distinct messages that fashion our cultural norms and expectations, turning our world into a maze of stumbling blocks and impediments, not just for women, but for every man in search of a way to truly be a man that doesn't jeopardize or denigrate women. That's the strength of our speech. It creates the world in which we live. So if we truly wish to end the epidemic of gender violence, then we need to learn to respect the power of our words, to create or to destroy. We must admit that the people we condemn for trying to render our speech politically correct are most often simply reminding us to make our speech morally correct. And then we have to unlearn what American culture has taught us and relearn what Judaism teaches us, that each human being, male and female, is created b'tselem Elohim, in the divine image, that each human being, male and female, deserves our respect, our support, and our compassion. Then shall we use our words wisely rather than carelessly to support survivors and to cultivate a culture of gender equality. Then shall we use our words warmly but definitively to underscore the dangers posed every time someone thoughtlessly utters a misogynist or violent comment. Hayom harat olam. Today the world stands as it did at its creation. And just as it once held forth an untouched dominion of potential for our Creator, so too does it hold forth an unlimited realm of possibilities for us. We can use the power of our words to sustain the world bequeathed to us by our ancestors, a world in which Tamar suffers in silence, a world in which too many blame survivors and treat gender violence as if it's a women's issue, in which we fail to acknowledge our responsibility for creating a culture that perpetuates sexual assault, sexual harassment, and domestic abuse. Or we can use our words to create a much different world, the world bestowed upon us by our Creator, a world in which men and women stand side by side on equal footing, in which our words consistently reflect our grandest values and aspirations, in which gender violence and the culture that promotes it are no longer tolerated. As some of you know, in a few short months, my wife and I hope to bring a daughter into this world. We hope to teach her to be loving and brave. We hope to teach her to be resilient. We hope to watch her grow and contribute to the world in ways we cannot even begin to imagine. But we have other hopes too. We hope that we'll be able to show her that she'll be universally valued for the gifts of her mind and her spirit. We hope we'll be able to tell her that men and women alike are invested in her happiness and safety. And we hope that one day, when her college professor asks her the question, "What do you do on a daily basis to prevent yourself from sexual assault?" she too will be able to say, "Nothing. I've never really thought about it." May this be our blessing in the new year and the world we bequeath for our children. Shana Tova.